In this video, we introduce three different perspectives on Paul: the so-called Old or Lutheran perspective on Paul, the so-called New perspective on Paul, and the so-called Radical New perspective on Paul. And I want to start out by saying that when I say something is old or new, don't necessarily think of those as evaluative terms. Don't think of older as worse and newer as better. What we'll see is that older does mean chronologically older, that the old perspective developed earlier than did the new perspective and the radical new perspective. But this is not to use old as a pejorative label. It is simply a heuristic device, and it is the terms by which you will often hear New Testament scholars talk about, or you will often see them write about these different perspectives on Paul. So when I use these terms, don't think about them as evaluative. And once again, our terms are going to be old or Lutheran perspective on Paul, new perspective on Paul, and radical new perspective, or Paul within Judaism perspective. And what I want you to be able to do by the end of this video and the end of this week is to really be able to understand and explain two of these perspectives very, very well. I'd like you to be able to know some things about all three of them, but really be able to recall and explain on your own two of the three. And then also be able to go to a particular Pauline passage and explain the different ways that these different perspectives might approach these passages, the questions, different kinds of questions they might ask, and how they might explain peculiar vocabulary or particular vocabulary in a given Pauline passage. So let's go ahead and get started here with our course thesis. We're talking about how Paul is theologically, or how Jesus is theologically significant for the authors of the New Testament. And the reason that I highlight this here in our course thesis is because we're really dealing with sort of a outsider or a sort of meta perspective on Paul. We're thinking about the lens by which we ourselves approach Paul. And the lens by which we approach Paul is going to change the way that we think Paul views and understands Jesus's significance. And we'll see towards the end of this lecture that these different perspectives on Paul understand Paul to think about Jesus's significance in different kinds of ways, that Jesus is significant differently for the old perspective, the new perspective, and the radical new perspective on Paul. And this is particularly the case with Paul's relevance to Jews and or Gentiles. And we'll get to all that in just a little bit here. So we're going to start out with the old and move to the new. So the Lutheran reading or the old perspective on Paul. And what we're going to do with each one of these is sort of trace the historical roots of them, and then some of the major figures with respect to them. And so, of course, the Lutheran reading of Paul is going to have Reformation roots with none other than the Lutheran reformer Martin Luther. So, of course, Martin Luther's, as you have learned or will learn from your church history class, the Apostle Paul, and particularly texts like Romans and Galatians, are going to be transformative for Luther's theology. And Luther is going to cast a very, very long shadow on readings of Paul, and particularly on Protestant readings and interpretations of Paul. And so this is we can sort of draw a straight line from the Lutheran readings from the Reformation with Martin Luther to 19th and 20th century German scholarship. So we haven't talked a lot about 19th and 20th century German scholarship in this class, but you should know that it sort of stands behind so much biblical scholarship with respect to both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so that in this 19th and 20th century German scholarship, it continues to be very much particularly 19th and 20th century Pauline German scholarship is going to continue to be influenced by Lutheran understandings and Lutheran interpretations of the Apostle Paul. And there's going to be some sort of pillars of this kind of understanding of Paul. And this is, of course, to paint in broad strokes and not to give nuance. There are, of course, some thinkers in these traditions who would not hold to these pillars or would want to nuance what I'm presenting here. And I say that because the first one I present is a little bit agonistic here, and this is the idea that the Judaism of Paul's day was highly legalistic, that Jews in Paul's context were very much concerned with keeping every single letter of the law. And one of the things that we've seen in this class, and one of the things that I really want you to take away from this class, is that Judaism in Paul's day and Judaism in the time of the New Testament is multifaceted and diverse. So to make a claim like this, to make a claim like all Jews in the New Testament context were legalistic, they were just concerned with the letter of the law, they weren't concerned with the spirit of the law, they really didn't get what God was up to with the law, it's a problematic claim. And it's not a claim that all Reformation thinkers would make, but generally speaking, this is sort of the lens by which Reformation readers of Paul understand what Paul thinks about Jews in his own context. And then for the old or the Lutheran perspective, what is going to be absolutely central, what's going to stand at the very center of all of Paul's thinking is going to be his revelation about justification by faith, namely that an individual sinner is justified not by the things they do, not by the works of the law, but is justified by faith, by their faith in the actions of Jesus Christ, in Jesus' death, resurrection. And that all is still, so that is all the center of the Lutheran perspective on Paul. So the Lutheran readings of Paul are going to say this is what guides all of Paul's thinking. And if one is to take a different perspective on Paul that maybe wouldn't see this as the center of Pauline theology, I want to be clear that one cannot think that justification by faith is the very center of Paul's theology. One can say, well, it's maybe something else that Paul's more concerned with justification by faith, and still recognize that justification by faith is incredibly important, not only for Paul, but theologically. So this is, when we move on to different perspectives, it's not to say that we throw out everything from these other perspectives, that these aren't sort of mutually exclusive things. And one of the sort of characteristics of the Lutheran reading or the old perspective on Paul is that Paul starts a Jew, that Paul is born and raised a Jew, and then he has this revelation on the Damascus Road and breaks with Judaism altogether to establish a new religion. That when Paul becomes a Christian, he is no longer working within Judaism. He leaves Judaism to found a new religion altogether. And so all of this is really going to be sort of the prominent view, especially in Protestant circles, until really the 1980s, and we start to see a sort of shift in the prominent perspective of Pauline scholarship starting in the 1980s. And this shift is towards what is now called the new perspective on Paul, which really sort of got its head of steam starting in the 80s and still is remarkably influential today. So one of the things that I'm asking you to read for this week is Krister Stendal's seminal essay for the new perspective. Most people would say this is sort of the essay that kicks off the new perspective, that gets the ball rolling, and there's going to be the snowball effect, that the snowball really picks up a head of steam into the 1980s. And it's of interest that Dr. Stendal is himself a Lutheran priest. So we see that line of Lutheran readings of Paul continuing on even into the new perspective itself. So as you reflect on your reading from Dr. Stendal for this week, bear in mind that he is in the Lutheran tradition. So he's not totally breaking from Lutheran readings of Paul. Much like Paul himself is not necessarily breaking from Judaism altogether, Dr. Stendal is not completely breaking from the Lutheran tradition with his own understanding and readings of Paul. Another major figure, or the next major figure for the new perspective on Paul, is going to be this man right here, Dr. E.P. Sanders, and particularly his book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And what Paul and Palestinian Judaism did was really lay out what is called, or what Sanders called, covenantal nomism. And the idea is that the law, the Jewish law, is not a way of staying in covenantal relationship with God. That God has already chosen Israel based on God's own love and merit and grace and decision, and has nothing to do with what Israel did. Israel didn't do something to get into a covenant relationship with God. And so they can't do things necessarily to, or I should say, the law is given as a way to stay in that relationship that's sort of already been given. It's not a way to enter into the relationship with God. It's not as though God said, here's the law, Israel. If you go through the law, then now you can be in special relationship with me. Rather, it was the opposite. And this is what covenantal nomism means. God chooses Israel and gives the law as a means of staying in sort of right relationship with God. And then James D.G. Dunn, who is going to be one of Sanders' students, and recently passed away. His major contribution to the new perspective on Paul is going to be that the term law, or the term works of the law in Paul, doesn't refer to all of the commandments, all 613 commandments you would find in the 5 books of Moses, but rather to particular Jewish practices that are going to be real identity markers of Jews in Paul's time. So these are going to be things like Sabbath observance, worshiping one God, monotheism, and not eating certain things, keeping kosher, not eating pork. So that when Paul talks about the law, he's not talking about the minutia of the law, or at least not in every case. That Paul thinks of the law also as these sort of major pillars that define what Judaism is. And then most recently, and a figure you may be most familiar with of these 4 white men on the screen here, and it's not an accident that these are 4 white men. Pauline scholarship has sort of long been dominated by white male figures, and this new perspective is sort of a don't want to say result of that, but as a picture of that. That is simply the case, that these are sort of white men have been the major figures in Western ways of thinking about Paul until more recent years, I should say. So N.T. Wright, here he is, man you may or may not be more familiar with. And what N.T. Wright's major contribution is going to be rethinking what justification is, this very key word for Paul, justification. And for Wright, justification is going to identify who is a part of the covenant community, so that one can be justified and become part of the community, whether one is an ethnic Gentile or an ethnic Jew. That justification and becoming a part of the covenant community, per N.T. Wright's reading of Paul, justification opens up the covenant to Gentiles, which was once sort of closed off to Gentiles. That there's a sort of universalizing tendency, or a universalizing reading of Paul, wherein the covenant was once restricted to Israel, to ethnic Jews. But per Wright's understanding of Paul, justification opens that relationship up to the wider world, to Gentiles, those who are not ethnically Jewish. And so as to the sort of pillars of the new perspective on Paul, or the pillars of interpretation, or the sort of major ways that the new perspective, people that take the new perspective are going to read Paul. So sort of in a break from the Lutheran readings of Paul, one of the major contributions of the new perspective on Paul is to understand that, or to claim that Judaism in Paul's day was not highly legalistic, that this caricature is unhelpful for understanding Paul, and that when we see more nuance to the Judaism in Paul's day, and when we rethink the nature of Judaism and Judaism's relationship to the law in Paul's day, it really reframes the way that we understand Paul and what he says about the law. The new perspective is also going to recognize and sort of situate Paul with Jewish conversation partners, that Paul is going to be dialoguing largely with other Jews, but also with Gentile thinkers at the same time. And then particularly distinctive of the new perspective is this idea that the apocalyptic Christ event, and we're going to talk about what apocalyptic means when we come to the book of Revelation, but apocalyptic literally means unveiling, or a sort of pulling back of the veil to reveal something. So the apocalyptic revealing of what God is up to in the Christ event radically changes Paul's Jewish theology. So the new perspective is going to put a lot of weight on Paul's conversion experience. Most New Testament or new perspective, scholars probably won't use that language of conversion experience. They probably would say something like transformation. But the apocalyptic Christ event, that God has done something new and radical in Jesus that changes things. And it changes things not just for Gentiles, but also for Jews. That Jesus' life, death, ministry, and resurrection is going to change Jewish theology according to Paul, according to the new perspective. So the new perspective reading on Paul is that this event has happened, and Paul understands it to change the way that both Jews and Gentiles relate to God, because what God has done in the life, death, ministry, and resurrection of Jesus. And this is going to be one of the ways that we see a break from the new perspective in what is often called the radical new perspective on Paul, or the Paul within Judaism perspective. And this is a much more recent development. Of course, the new perspective is recent as well, but you even see it in the name, radical new perspective. You can only add so many adjectives meaning new, so radical new perspective is added because it's newer, and also because it is a bit more radical and you might say progressive in its outlook. And the sort of one of the core things about the radical new perspective on Paul is that for many of the interpreters of Paul who take this perspective, they see sort of a two ways covenant, that God has a covenant with ethnic Jews and God has a covenant with Gentiles. And this, again, is what Paul thinks according to the radical new perspective. So you sort of put on your radical new perspective lenses, and then you look through those lenses at Paul to what Paul thinks. And so according to this perspective, Paul thinks that God still has a covenant for ethnic Jews, but in the Jesus event, in Jesus' life, death, ministry, and resurrection, a new covenant, a new and different covenant has been opened up for Gentiles, those who are not ethnically Jewish. And so the result is that Gentiles can now enter into a relationship with the Jewish God, and this becomes the sort of very center of Paul's ideology, is that this new event with Jesus has opened up something totally brand new with respect to how Gentiles relate to the Jewish God. And so Paul becomes ultra concerned with Gentiles. And of course, we do actually see this to be the case both in Paul's letters and in his ministry, that he has a strong concern for the Gentiles, that he's the apostle to the Gentiles. And I want to highlight one particular thinker, or one particular scholar in this that's within the radical new perspective on Paul, and this is Dr. Pamela Eisenbaum. There she is, and her sort of most famous and most popular most popular level book is called Paul Was Not a Christian. So you can see even in that title this idea of sort of the two ways covenant. So according to Dr. Eisenbaum, Paul is going to remain ethnically Jewish, And his sort of Jewish practices really aren't going to change that much, or his Jewish identity is not going to be altered based on the Jesus event. His practice, of course, and his theology is going to be altered, but that practice and theology is with respect to the Gentile covenant that God has now opened up for Gentiles based on Jesus's life, death, ministry, and resurrection. So really key to Dr. Eisenbaum's thinking is going to be that Paul does not undergo some kind of conversion experience, and he does undergo a transformation, but it's not even a transformation of necessarily his own practice, but it's a transformation of thinking of God's relationship to Gentiles. And what Dr. Eisenbaum and others are going to do is they're going to be really dependent on the historical circumstances of each particular Pauline letter. So rather than taking sort of all of Paul's letter and trying to construct a systematic theology of Paul, radical New Perspective thinkers are going to really try and figure out what are the circumstances that stand behind each particular Pauline letter, and how is Paul addressing them. And they're going to emphasize that Paul is not necessarily addressing issues the exact same way or necessarily even consistently in each letters. He might do one thing in Philippians and do something different in Romans based on what he knows about the communities in Philippi or the communities in Rome. And another thing that they're going to be really honed in on is Paul's rhetoric in each letter. And particularly the fact that what Paul does in many of his letters, and we see this sort of full-blown in Romans, is that Paul creates literary dialogue partners, where at sometimes Paul is speaking himself and saying sort of his perspective, and then at other times in the letter, he's having this dialogue with a constructed interlocutor or a constructed figure, so that sometimes when Paul is writing things, he's speaking in that character or giving that character voice, and that character may not actually be what Paul thinks on a given topic, but is raising objections or is raising questions that Paul then can respond to. And so for the radical New Perspective, and this is going to vary from interpreter to interpreter, but certain sections of Pauline letters don't actually represent sort of Paul's most distilled or pure thought. Rather, they are a sort of reflection of another way of thinking that Paul is actually addressing. And so this is this last bullet point here, that some of the things Paul writes is not Paul necessarily speaking in his own voice. So we really need to be, for these thinkers, they really want to be attuned to who is speaking when in these different letters, and how that matters for constructing what Paul thinks and believes, and what Jesus' significance is theologically, particularly with respect to the Gentile question. And so I bring in all these perspectives not to ask you to sort of choose one or the other. One of the things that I really want to encourage you to think about is that so much of what we do, and particularly when we're trying to distill ways that people think, is to present them in systematic ways. But of course, you don't have to fall within one of these camps, and I certainly don't. There are things that I find really theologically attractive and right about the old perspective. There are things that I find very right about the new perspective, and there are things that I find right about the radical new perspective. But it is also to say that they sort of have a somewhat of a logic to them, that how you think about one thing about Paul's theology might affect how you think about this other thing as well. But this is also not to say that the different perspectives don't agree on something. So what I want to do is highlight those things that all three of these perspectives that I presented here are going to agree upon. And one is that Paul is concerned with salvation and the worship of the Jewish God. That worship and salvation and justification are very, very important for Paul's thinking and for Paul's theology, particularly with respect to the Christ event. What Jesus did, said, his death and resurrection are going to have massive consequences for Paul's Jewish worldview, but they're going to have massive consequences in different kinds of ways. So the Christ event is sort of this bomb that is dropped on Paul, but the fallout from that bomb is going to be different according to the different perspectives. According to all three perspectives, covenantal worship of the Jewish God is opened up to Gentiles because of Jesus' life, death, ministry, and resurrection. And this is one of the pillars of Paul's thought, that for all three perspectives, Gentiles can worship and be in relationship to God, both in an individual sense, an individual Gentile, but also collective Gentiles can enter into this covenantal relationship. But the nature of that covenant is going to differ from perspective to perspective. And for all of the perspectives, they're all going to say that Gentiles should not rely on works of the law. So your wheels might be spinning of why I put Gentiles there rather than people should not rely on works of the law. And that is because different perspectives are going to think differently of how the works of the law are relevant to Jews on the one hand and Gentiles on the other. So if the different perspectives agree on some things, they also, of course, don't agree on some things. And one of the main ones is the Judaism of Paul's day, the nature of it. And one of the things that I think we should really take away from the new perspective and the radical new perspective, and one of the things that I personally, theologically and with respect to my scholarship, is the fact that the Judaism of Paul's day was not monolithic, and it was not monolithically legalistic. That to bring that lens to understanding Judaism of Paul's day and the Judaism of the New Testament in general is a harmful way of thinking about Judaism, not only for our interpretation, but it's been harmful in the history of Christian and Jewish relations. And then the other thing that they're not going to agree on is what works of the law refers to and the significance of the law for Paul in different ways. So, of course, for the old perspective, the works of the law are going to be more about keeping those individual commandments, whereas the works of the law for the new perspective and the radical new perspective are going to be more about these sort of core identity markers that really draw out the lines of what counts as Judaism in Paul's day. And then the center of Paul's theology, what it is that really that Paul's most focused on, is going to differ from these different perspectives. For the Lutheran or old perspective, those interpreters are largely going to think that Paul is very concerned with a sort of individualized salvation, how a specific person is made right and enters into a covenantal relationship with God. Whereas the center of Paul's theology for the new perspective is going to be about justification, and is going to be about how justification has changed on the basis of the Christ event, and how the covenant has been opened up to both Jews and Gentiles simultaneously. And then for the radical new perspective, the center of Paul's theology is going to be, what the heck do we do with Gentiles given this bombshell of the Christ event that just dropped? So that the focus on Gentiles in particular is going to be the center of Paul's theology according to the radical new perspective. And then lastly here, how relevant, don't think of how as a level here, but the ways in which Jesus' death and resurrection are relevant for Jews is going to differ from perspective to perspective. So that, for example, in the radical new perspective, Jesus' life, death, ministry, and resurrection under their reading of Paul may not be that relevant for those who are ethnically Jewish. Those that are ethnically Jewish sort of could, in some ways, go on living the same way and go on practicing their Judaism in the same ways, though they should also recognize that a relationship with God has been opened up to Gentiles. But because of this sort of two covenant situation in the radical new perspective, Jews' day-to-day life might not change that much according to the radical new perspective. Whereas Jesus' death and resurrection in the new perspective are going to be very relevant for both Jews and Gentiles, that the whole idea of Israel and the whole idea of covenant has been expanded and reformulated to include Gentiles, that Gentiles and Jews are now in this new re-established community. There's not two ways of salvation. There's one new community based on the death, resurrection of Jesus. And then in the old perspective, Jesus' death and resurrection are relevant for Jews insofar as the old perspective thinkers are going to generally think that Jews should convert to Christianity, that they should accept the claims of Jesus as Messiah and be a part of this new religion that has come out of the Judaism that preceded it. And the last thing I want to do here before I ask you to do a little bit of reflection on these different perspectives is to think about some Pauline vocabulary. And I'm going to put these terms out there, putting them in English and in Greek for those of you in the Greek class or who have taken Greek previously. These are going to be terms that are very, very essential for Paul. And I want to give a little bit of sort of nuance, or I want to give a constellation of different translations that we might think about with respect to terms. So this word pistis is usually translated faith. It refers to both the individual person's faith. It refers to Israel's faith. It refers to the Gentiles' faith. And it also refers to God and Jesus's faith. And we're going to see this as a sort of one of the primary themes in our textbook reading as well. But faith is more than just sort of spiritual or intellectual assent to an idea. It has this fuller idea of sort of allegiance or commitment, that one is faithful to something like their country or to the emperor or to a political candidate or to, in the case of Christians, to a crucified and resurrected Galilean Jew. So there's more to faith than just an element of belief. There's something about an allegiance which requires a change in life and patterns of behavior. Gospel, euangelion, is going to be good news, glad tidings, and it's for Paul, it's really about what God has done in Jesus's death and resurrection. Euangelion, sort of as a term, or gospel as a term classically conceived, is orally proclaimed good news, a good message. Oftentimes it was used or its primary connotation was of the good news of military victory. So a messenger, one who bears good news, brings back from sort of the front lines of the army or the war the good news of a military victory over XYZ people, nation, or group. And so for Paul, of course, it means something different. It means the good news of Jesus' life, death, ministry, and resurrection. Grace is going to be about divine favor, both towards Israel historically and also towards Gentiles in the new situation that's been opened up based on Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. Righteousness is, we often think of this as sort of a moral, spiritual category, but it's also more than that. It's the same word that's used for justice, or what God sort of asks of people to be in covenant relationship or to stay in covenant relationship with him. Law is God's instruction to Israel, and it's not just those 613 commandments that you would find in the 5 books of Torah, but it also is going to mean a lot more. And as we've seen, this is going to differ from perspective to perspective. But it's also about the peculiar or particular practices of Jews in Paul's day that are according to the law. So that works of the law are not just about specific deeds one does, but they're about in a way of life that shapes one's identity. Salvation is this sort of inbreaking of God's kingdom into the present world, but it's also forward-looking. It has something future to it. So it's not simply this spiritual category, but it's something that has a worldly effect for Paul. And then lastly, sin is going to be not only sort of individual offenses against God, certainly that is one of the connotations of sin in Paul, but it's also going to be this sort of power that has a sort of grip over human beings. That it's not just about these particular wrong things that a person does, but it's about an entire power. And so for different perspectives on Paul, this is going to play out in different ways. So for example, in the radical new perspective, they're going to say something like, according to Paul, sin has a grip on both Jews and Israel, but also on Gentiles, but more so on Gentiles, that because Gentiles sort of weren't first in this special relationship with God, they're more prone to sinning than are Jews. Of course, that's going to be a very different notion from what you find in the old perspective, which is really going to emphasize the flattening of all people, that Jews and Gentiles all are sinners in God's eyes, hearkening to Romans chapter 3 here. So sin is not going to be just individual offenses, but it's also this power that has force over Gentiles and Jews in different ways in these different perspectives. So how I want to conclude here is with a lecture pause for your course notes. And I want you to not think necessarily about the sort of the intellectual bullet points or the pillars of the different perspectives on Paul. I want you to think of sort of as you were watching this presentation on the different perspectives and as you thought about the different theological tenets that I had presented stand behind these different perspectives. Think about the ones that you sort of you maybe reacted against negatively, and those that you reacted towards positively. Did you find that there were certain things from the old perspective, the new perspective, the radical new perspective that you found particularly difficult pills to swallow, or that you found sort of aligned with your own thinking? So what I want you to do is take 5 minutes, and I would encourage you to set a timer for this, and you can just do this in the course notes by typing it out, or you can of course write by hand. There's a value to that as well. And answer this question here, just in a free write or 5 minutes, of what you find from the various perspectives to be congruous or in step with your own thinking and understanding of Paul, or it could be your own sort of theology generally, and what you find to be out of step. So maybe there are things from the radical new perspective that you found to be out of step, or maybe there are things from the old perspective that you found to be out of step with your own way of thinking, and sort of lay those out and try and match them up. Not with. Don't go and look back to the perspectives. I want you to try and do this from memory. But those things from the different perspectives that you found yourself gravitating either towards or away from.